Two bills in California we got to talk about. First, AB 2934. This is the most shockingly, obviously, blatantly unconstitutional bill I've literally ever seen. It would make it illegal for any counselor to say anything to try and I quote, eliminate or reduce sexual or romantic attractions or feelings towards individuals of the same sex. Another part of this bill, a religious ministry cannot have a conference where a speaker talks about avoiding homosexual behavior. If I said anything about fighting unwanted same-sex attraction, then I would be breaking the law.
Life matters, and the issues in life matter because they affect how we live our lives. In this podcast, Pastor Walt McFadden thinks out loud about truth and discerns how it is being applied to everyday life. Thinking Out Loud podcast is a production of Cityview Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Pastor Walt, I saw recently on the internet that the Pew Research had something to say about the rising tide of homosexuality. In other words, more and more people everywhere, not just in secular society, are accepting homosexuality. And my first question, especially for the church, I sort of understand why they accept it in the world, but in the church, I don't understand that. So why is it such a big issue for the church anyway?
Because biblically, we are supposed to be the salt and the light. And if we sit by and we allow the culture to rot and don't do anything about it, then we have lost our mission as salt and light. One of the things that we fail to see because we hear a different opinion is that history shows homosexuality has not been good for any culture. There must have been something that not only the Christians, the early Christians saw in the Roman Empire, but there must have been something that the culture saw. As we heard the stories about Christians walking through the alleys in the early morning, listening to the cries of babies that have been thrown into the trash. And that's what happens when you have unfettered sexuality and you don't keep it within God's plan. Somebody's going to pay the price for that. I love to study the history of the Israelites. Why did God judge Israel? He specifically warned them when they entered into the promised land, do not follow the god Molech. Why? Because he required child sacrifice. We also live in this time and in this culture when we have materialism. We don't have to pay the price for our behavior because, if I can say it as simply as this, we have the dollars to cover up our mistakes. But it hasn't always been that way in history. Now, at some point, there will come a tipping point in our culture. And unfortunately, the voices who are sounding the alarm now are not going to be around when that tipping point occurs.
And yet, historically, I think you can make a good case for what you just said. However, today, 54% of Christians are agreeing with same-sex marriage.
I think it's going to be diverse from church to church. Every church has a different opinion on the issue, and every gay person is different. And I think that to speak the church, the black church or white church or any kind of church you want to call it, are all the same is totally not true. And all gay people are not the same. The types of relationships that are afforded are based on the types of people in each individual case. Yeah. And LGBTs of types and sorts have to find a household of worship that reflects what your views are and what you believe like anybody else.
Gay marriage supporters have a new reason to celebrate. The Presbyterian Church USA just paved the way for same-sex couples to get married. After decades of debate over the issue, the church's legislative body last year endorsed a new definition of marriage, which includes a, quote, commitment between two people.
Why so many Christians are accepting it?
Number one, it begins in the pulpit. Pastors are wimps. They are afraid to preach the truth. They are cowardly in what they speak about. And just speaking from my church, I think people appreciate when they come to Cityview Church. I know exactly what this church preaches and teaches. I know exactly. I heard a phrase a long time ago, people don't take hints. You have to say it clearly. So we can dance around the issue of homosexuality, but the Bible is crystal clear that it's wrong.
So I know at one point in my ministry years ago, when I preached on this topic, several people emailed me on Monday morning saying, Pastor, I would be ashamed if I brought my homosexual friend to church. And this was a text right out of Romans 1 where, Paul is condemning same-sex kind of relationships. Do you get pushback like that when you're speaking about critical issues in culture like homosexuality or abortion or any of the major themes that we push back on?
Absolutely. I've had those same emails. I've had those sit-downs. And I will say to the person, I will listen to your biblical arguments, but the arguments are not biblical. They're just arguments that I've heard through the media or through some article. Years ago, Newsweek magazine put out an article, and on the cover, it said, "Is there a gay gene?" Well, the article came to the conclusion they don't know either way if there was, but how many people passed by, checked out of the grocery store, and thought because of that provocative question, there must be a gay gene. And I've heard people screaming and yelling on the radio, "You're an idiot because you don't believe that there's a gay gene." Well, to this day, we're 30 years, 40 years from when this idea was first proposed, and they have not found a gay gene, and they will not find a gay gene. Our sexuality is not determined at birth. We receive our view or perspective of sexuality by our experiences in life.
There was a very famous Christian pastor, I'll mention his name, it's Eugene Peterson from out in the Northwest. He was the author of The Message, the Bible, The Message, and he was asked once if he was still pastoring, if he would perform a same-sex marriage. And he said yes. And the only reason that he changed that response was because Lifeway Books was going to ban all of his book sales throughout their store. So then he recanted, which was to me, like you said a little bit earlier about pastors being a wuss. I mean, he really caved in, not because it was a conviction, but it was because of money. So is that where a lot of these pastors are at? I mean, in terms of not taking the scripture at face value and sort of compromising it with sort of a cultural taint?
Well, that example shows perfectly that that is not a conviction for him. If it was a conviction for him, he would stand by it. And that's the problem with the church. There isn't clear-cut conviction. We've fallen into this trap where whatever you say is equal to what I say, and there's no absolute truth. We've been down that road and had that discussion many times before. What we're seeing now, and every statistic will prove it when we analyze the church, is the church has that mindset. And that's what drives me crazy. Whatever ridiculous idea somebody comes up with, hey, let's come up with the idea of gay marriage. And then the world is so crafty at advertising their message, they don't say gay marriage anymore. They say freedom to marry. And I'm driving behind a car that has that bumper sticker on the back, and I say to myself, everybody has the freedom to marry. Nobody is restricted from being married, but everything is pro. And so if you're not pro, then you're against. And there's peer pressure in that. When my son was in high school, they brought in an LGBT group, and they said, if you are for gay marriage, stand on one side of the room, and if you're against it, stand on the other side. Well, he was the only kid in the class of 20-some to stand by himself on one side. So I called the principal. The first words out of his mouth are, "We're not trying to indoctrinate anybody." Are you kidding me? Of course you're trying to indoctrinate. You're trying to peer pressure people in, and this happens all over the place. They do this everywhere. They're crafty, they're smart, they have a plan. They said in the beginning, all we want to do is be left alone. And then they said, we want you to tolerate our behavior. And now we see the Supreme Court decision with the baker refusing to bake the cake for the homosexual couple. We are going to force acceptance upon you. We can't stand the idea that there are people in the world that exist who disagree with our perspective or our point of view. And that's something that the church fails to understand about the world. Evil doesn't rest idly. evil pursues an agenda, and they're going to keep knocking on the doors of the church. And maybe this is a crazy idea, but some of my elders have come to me and said, we need to be prepared for the possibility that someday you might be imprisoned, our pastor, for what you believe.
Permit me to take you to London. That's in Great Britain. A young man doing some open-air preaching is stopped. Why? Because somebody complained. That's right. This preacher said something that annoyed a person. The police responded. Why? Because of the mechanism that they are currently using in Great Britain. It's called the Public Order Act. It sounds, well, so British. But it is the law that says if you in public say something that bugs somebody, I thought that's what free speech rights were for, then you can be shut down, just like this young open-air preacher.
You're listening to Thinking Out Loud with Walt McFadden.
You know, the safest place for a Jew in the 1920s was Germany. Britain, France, Spain had much higher rate of anti-Semitism, and how quickly the culture changed. And we're seeing that now. They want to restrict the message, and that brings fear. If it begins in the church, if we're afraid to stand up, then eventually that group that preaches the truth comes smaller and smaller and smaller until we're already in this stage. You're sort of looked at as a fanatic, as a weirdo, backward, you're not with the times. But God's truth is eternal. I was reading last night in Genesis, and we're reading the creation story there in Genesis 1 through 3. What is the ideal before the corruption of man? What is God's plan before man messes up creation? It's male and it's female. Now, man messes it up because he has polygamous relationships. And then Moses says to the people, there's an ideal, but you're not living by the ideal. So God allows you to divorce by this certificate. And then we get into all kinds of other behaviors where you have homosexuality. God warns against bestiality. Why does he have to warn against that? Because that's the nature of evil. Man will find any way that he possibly can to satisfy his desires. But when we look at creation, and I can talk about the Bible all day long, but sometimes people say, well, that's your religious perspective. But looking at the undamaged creation, you have male and female. That's the perfect plan. And no matter what anyone says, monogamy is the best way. It's the best place for children. It's the most healthy relationship. It's good for society. It's good for the country. It's good for the nation. Even the United States government has recognized it's good for people to be married. It's good for children to be in marriage. And so we have tax laws that favor marriage because we know that it's positive.
One of the things that I want to come back to real quickly, you had opened up an answer to a question about why should Christians or the church be concerned about homosexuality, and you said basically because of moral rot within society. And so that begs the question, if there is no moral voice, such as the church, then everything then actually becomes more evil and more reprobate. And so there needs to be a voice that says, wait a minute, is this right? Just questioning it, what is right about homosexuality or about any issue? That's the moral fiber that the church was, I think, entrusted to. Would you agree?
Exactly. And it comes from a failure of belief. Our culture, since the beginning of the United States and previous, had an idea that, or a foundation, that there was good and evil in the world. And so when Ronald Reagan got up and called the Soviet Union the evil empire back in the 1980s, people flipped their lids because they said, you can't call anything evil. There's people over there. But my foundation is the belief that there's good and evil, and that evil will not rest. But evil wants to overcome good. But Jesus gave us a promise to the church that the darkness has come against the light, but it will not overcome the light. The light will overcome the darkness. And you can choose whichever side you want to be on. That's part of the problem too. We want to pick this middle ground. Either we don't want to talk about the message or we want to soft pedal the message. We don't have the view and perspective in the church that there will be an end time judgment. Some people will go to hell. And Jesus said, few will be saved. He didn't say a lot of people. He didn't say half the people. He didn't say most of the people. He said, few will be saved. We can't seem to get that message into our heads. We want to please everybody. We want to include everybody. And the gospel is an exclusive message. Whosoever will come. Jesus never catered to those people who didn't want to accept his whole message. He got as graphic as he possibly could. Eat my flesh, drink my blood, take up your cross, and follow me daily. What more stark examples could you think of for following someone? But that's the problem with the church. If the church would preach the unadulterated truth of God and stop catering to people who maybe just use the church as a moral crutch rather than want to come and become true followers and disciples of Jesus Christ. Let me just put it this way. The quality of the product that the church is producing is pathetic. We are not producing quality disciples of Jesus Christ who are grounded in the Word and truly understand the message. One of the things we've done in our church is we start with a discipleship, and every single person in the church needs to go through. We start in membership class, and the first question is, what is the gospel? Most Christians can't even articulate what the gospel is. They can't even tell you that our relationship with God is broken and that it's only repaired through Jesus Christ and acceptance of him as Lord and Savior. Jesus, to so many people in Western culture now, is my friend. And I like him because he's my friend, and my friend never challenges me. It's sort of like, when you want to get away from your parents and you want to go out and have a good time when you're a teenager. I want to get away from my parents. They have all these rules and regulations. I want to go with my friend. I want to get away from this church because this church is spiritually abusing me. This church is oppressive. I want to go over here with this other pastor because he's nice and he's friendly. And he tells me wonderful things about myself every single Sunday. What's the power in that? And people are voting with their feet. They just think, hey, I can get that from Oprah. I can get that from Joel Osteen. And people like him, preachers like him, sorry to say, he's the problem. That is the problem with the church. That every Sunday I go in there and I get this wonderful message, this feel-good message, and nothing about the hard truths of the gospel. So it isn't just the issue of homosexuality. It's to the root of the gospel itself. There is a war, a spiritual war, and the war is occurring within the church. And the question is, what is the gospel? Has the gospel changed? Does the gospel need to change? Or is that message as relevant as it was for the followers of Jesus 2,000 years ago? I say it is.
And I would too. I'm going to come back to something you said about your elders, thinking about our pastor may be in jail someday because you're preaching the truth. Do you think the Bible at some point will become a hate document? Could it actually get to that? Because the only way you're going to get in jail, Pastor Walt, is if you're continuing to preach the Bible, right?
Absolutely. And that's happened in other places in the world. Think about how frightening that would be for my congregation. Our pastor is in prison. The early church experienced that. Our leader is in prison. I don't want to go to prison. I don't want to be beat. I don't want to be tortured, whatever the consequence might be. That's a frightening thing, but that's what Jesus called us to. We have to think again about this gospel message. Is this gospel message relevant around the world? Will that be the experience of a Christian in China or Saudi Arabia? Because they don't have the luxury of sitting in a church with a coffee shop, with a wonderful children's program and children's area, and be told warm and fuzzies. When they follow Jesus, there's a price to be paid. And that price shows the value of the gospel. I think that's another problem. We don't put much value in the gospel. Is the gospel worth me going to prison? Is it that good? Is it that worthwhile? For the 12 men that started out, it was worthwhile. and every one of them except one gave their lives for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Could I see myself going to prison someday? Maybe not in my lifetime, but I worry about my children. Because eventually, again, evil won't stop. It'll keep pushing and pushing and pushing until it gets its way.
All right, Travis, talk to me about this bill. This is essentially criminalizing religious beliefs. And I don't mean to speak in hyperbole here, but if this bill were to pass, would this prohibit the sale of the Bible that teaches these things about sexual morality?
Well, literally, according to how this law is written, yes, it would. PC culture, politically correct culture, gone horribly awry. This is really directly hitting at our First Amendment rights as American citizens. Now the Democrat legislators in this building right behind me, the California State Legislature, they want to tell you how to think, what sort of books that you can read, write, and purchase. It is completely wrong. It is absolutely against our First Amendment rights.
So as we bring this to a conclusion today, Pastor Walt, I'm wondering what advice you would give to those who are listening who may be sitting in churches who never hear kind of the harder message of the gospel, the price that it really costs for someone to follow Jesus. What advice would you give?
Well, speaking to a person who maybe is homosexual themselves or a person who has a close relative, a child, the gospel is worth it. Jesus constantly called people to deny themselves. He says to the rich young ruler, Jesus is so perceptive. I see something in you that's more important than me. You have all this wealth and you have all this power. Unless you lay that down, you can't follow me. Everybody has their issue in life. Every person is born imperfect, but the gospel is worth it. And Jesus calls us to lay down those things, to lay them aside. It isn't even an issue about, was I born this way? Was I not? Can I change? Can I not? I believe that most homosexual people can change. They can come into a different kind of relationship, into a heterosexual relationship. But if that is not your experience, I still say the gospel is worth it. That the value, the price that Jesus paid on the cross demonstrates his love for you. And as I address this issue today, my question is, do you want me to lie to you and let you feel good, or do you want me to tell you the truth and allow you to be set free? Truth and love go together. I can't love you without giving you the truth. And that's what's absent in their message. That message is no different than the message you find out in the world. We love you and we totally accept you. God never accepts us the way we are. We have to change, and that means some of our behavior has to change. Yes, God loves us, but the truth is that we are broken and we are sinful.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast today, and please let us know your thoughts on our topic. We want to hear your feedback and your concerns as you think out loud. Please visit us at cvcmpls.org. That's cvcmpls.org. This podcast is listener-supported. Please consider how you can help by going to our website at cvcmpls.org.